that there's a special significance and a special spiritual connection between the greatest Indian philosopher and Mother's Day. So we are going to find. Now, Shankaracharya, if you read any book or if you consult any social media, what you find is the description is a great philosopher saint who lived in 8th century AD, who wrote great books, great poetical classics, and was a reformer and reorganizer of Hindu tradition, Vedantic tradition, the original exponent of Vedanta philosophy. That's what you find. Now, when you talk about a great saint, a philosopher, there are different ways of analyzing his work and his contributions. Now, I'm going to quote one very important observation by somebody who could be called the greatest Western disciple of Swami Vivekananda. Because Vedanta philosophy was brought to this country by Swami Vivekananda. And Shankaracharya is the original exponent of this system of philosophy and spirituality. Now, the writer from whom I'm quoting was Sister Nivedita. She was not a traditional temple-going Hindu or Indian or a believer in that conventional sense. She was a great social reformer. She was a great supporter of the new education movement, which originally started in the middle, maybe in the 1830s and 1840s in England. And she was also a great admirer of two of modern educationists and education philosophers, Pestalozzi and Frober. Pestalozzi was, he called Pestalozzi, he was a Swedish educationist, somebody who for the first time in the history of education argued that in the educational process, students also have an important role to play. Education is not something that you put in their heads. Education is a way of helping a student to evolve and bring out the best in him or in her, and helping in the evolution, in the cultural evolution of the student. So Pestalozzi was a Swedish education reformer, and he had a great German follower, Frober. He was also a great contributor to education psychology, education philosophy. And together they actually laid the foundation for what we now call modern educational reforms, which not what we witnessed in the world during the post-First World War days, but what we witnessed in the 1830s and 1840s. Pestalozzi and Frober. Any student of education psychology or education philosophy will have to study elaborately their contributions to education philosophy. Sister Nivedita was born as Miss Margaret Noble in Ireland, was a close student in the sense she was a great supporter of this new education movement and a great admirer of both Pestalozzi and also Frober. She was some kind of a, you may call sometimes the British aristocrats reportedly called her a kind of intellectual upstart. So she was not a believer in the conventional sense, not even a believer in the Catholic Christianity into which she was born. But that lady has something very interesting to say about Shankaracharya. So you have to remember, we are not listening to the words of a typical temple-going Orthodox Hindu or Indian, or a Vedantin devotee of San Francisco Vedanta Society. No. We are listening to the words of an Irish revolutionary who played a very important role in the early stages of the social education reform in Ireland in the later half of 19th century, who actually supported and tried to promote the revolutionary educational ideas of both Pestalozzi and Frober, the Swedish and the German educational philosophers. And you know what she has to say about Shankaracharya? So you find in the well-known book, The Web of Indian Life. She was born, as I mentioned, as Miss Margaret Noble, became a great admirer of Swami Vivekananda, who gave him the name Nivedita, which a feminine gender means the one who is dedicated to a higher cause. And she spent the rest of her lifetime, after meeting Vivekananda, she spent the rest of her lifetime serving the poor, the young widows living in Calcutta and many parts of Bengal, trying to promote education, self-reliance, and all these values among them. You know what she says about Shankaracharya? So you can listen. Shankaracharya wandered during his short life, 32 years, he lived only for 32 years, from his birthplace in the south as far as the Himalayas, and everything that he came across in his travels related itself to the one focus and center in his mind. He accepted each worship, he respected and accepted every form of religious tradition, religious practice, no matter where it originated, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Jainism, anything. Wherever a human being sincerely prays or aspires for something transcendental, he will accept and he will respect them. So he wandered during his short lifetime from his birthplace in the south as far as the Himalayas. You have to remember, almost 3,000 miles, more than 3,000 miles. Wandering, walking. He was born in the extreme south. And most of his work was close to Indo-Tibetan border. And many of his institutions were in the extreme east and west, close to Pakistan-Afghanistan border. He accepted each worship, even that from which he was at first adverse, but always because he found that the great mood of one without a second was not only the Vedic but also the Puranic goal. This is the doctrine that he expresses in his 12 epoch-making commentaries. He wrote many books, but the most important books are 12 classics which constitute the most profound works on Eastern philosophy. And he finished all these writings before he was 16. That means if you meet a 9th grader student from the nearby school, before that age, this philosopher had written all his classics. And today if you go to Kashi, Benares or Himalayas, you find huge pot-bellied Brahmins, 70 years, 80 years, spending 40 years studying the books written by this 16-year-old young boy. So it takes decades for you to completely master the works he wrote, the super commentaries, the Bhashyas, Vartikas, all other related books. Now this is the type of person we are going to discuss today. He had finished all these great works. Remember, in Western tradition, the greatest philosopher, the greatest Orientalist in Western tradition was Paul Deussen. He was a German who went to India, studied Sanskrit, became a Sanskrit Pandit. He himself says it took him several years to master one of the 12 books that he wrote. Remember, actually he wrote more than 170 works. Of his 12 books constitute the most important philosophical classics. He also wrote more than 100 poetical works, many dozens and dozens of introductory works. So you can imagine, as I mentioned earlier, if you go to Benares today, if you go to Badrinath today, if you go to Kailas Math today, you find old monks 70, 80 years, or traditional Brahmin scholars with huge pot-bellied Brahmins, old people, spending every day 10 hours, 15 hours studying the works of somebody who was 16 years when he had written all these books. So this is the interesting story. Now what Sister Nivedita has to say about this young boy, that's what we are going to read. Western people can hardly imagine a personality such as that of Shankaracharya. As I mentioned, this is not the exaggeration coming from an illiterate person. These words are coming from Miss Margaret Noble, who played a very important role in introducing the new education movement in Ireland in the later half of 19th century, who was responsible for the promotion of the great revolutionary ideas of modern education psychology and education philosophy, which contributed to the world by Pestalozzi and Froebel, the Swedish and German philosophers. So Sister Nivedita was not only the greatest of Vivekananda's Western disciples, and maybe the most intellectual among the great Western disciples of Swami Vivekananda, but she was also somebody who lived to make her name really meaningful. Nivedita means dedicated. Her whole life was dedicated to a great spiritual cause. And she says, Western people can hardly imagine a personality such as that of Shankaracharya. In the course of so few years, 32 years, to have nominated the founders of no less than 10 great religious orders. He is the founder of 10 monastic orders. Today, if you go to India, you can never find a monk or a nun who doesn't belong to one of the 10 monastic orders that he founded. It's a very important thing to remember. The Chinmaya mission is Saraswati order, Ramakrishna mission is Puri order. Even Madhvacharya, who was opposed to him philosophically, belonged to one of the Tirtha orders, which he himself founded. Anyway, so coming to subject. Of which 4 have fully retained their popularity even now. To have acquired such a mass of Sanskrit learning as to create a distinct philosophical system and to impress himself on the scholarly imagination of India in a preeminence that 1200 years have not sufficed to shake. After 1200 years, he still remains the greatest and most respected name in Indian philosophical tradition, Indian spiritual tradition. Ramakrishna mission also is a continuation of the one of the 10 monastic orders that he founded, Puri order, because Sri Ramakrishna himself took sannyasa from Tota Puri, was a member of one of the 10 monastic orders that Shankaracharya founded in 8th century AD. To have written poems, poetical works, whose grandeur makes them unmistakable. And even to the foreign and learned here, it is said that when Sister Nivedita and other Western disciples of Swami Vivekananda used to travel in the Himalayas, Swamiji used to recite in ecstasy the great poetical works of Shankaracharya. And though many of the Western disciples naturally could not understand the meaning of these Sanskrit words, still they could spiritually relate and they felt transported to a state of ecstasy. Sister Nivedita, if you read The Web of Indian Life and her complete works, the first volume, if you read, you can just find out, you can see how Sister Nivedita and other Western disciples were transported to a state of ecstasy listening to Vivekananda's recitation of these great poems of Shankaracharya. To have written, and then even to the foreign unlearned ear, and at the same time to have lived with his disciples in all the radiant joy and simple pathos of the saints. This is greatness that we may appreciate from a distance, but cannot understand. We contemplate with wonder and delight the devotion of Saint Francis of Assisi, the intellect of Abelard, the force and freedom of Martin Luther, the political efficiency of Ignatius Loyola, Augustine Aquinas. But who could imagine all this united in one person who lived only for 32 years. So now, why his life is very relevant on the day on which we are celebrating Mother's Day? There is another side of this great philosopher saint. You know, his mother was shocked when the little child, 6 years old, expressed his desire to become a monk. 6 years. Finally, somehow, he managed to get her blessings very reluctantly. But on one promise, she made him promise that on the day of her death, he will come to her deathbed and see her. That's the only promise she wanted from her 6-year-old son, who was about to travel in search of his guru. 1,200 miles he walked from extreme south Kaladi to a place called Shankaracharya called Indore, near Indore in Madhya Pradesh, which in those days there was no connection, there was no way to walk. So 1,200 miles he walked in search of his guru. And then when he was almost about 17 years, that means he had already finished all his writings, and great scholars in different parts of India had already started studying his works. Remember, it was a very elitist social landscape in those days. Shankaracharya wrote only in Sanskrit. So, and not only Shankaracharya, the great Buddhist philosophers of those times, like Vijnana Bhikshu, Dignaga, or Dhammavala, Vasubandhu, Chandrakirti, Nagarjuna, all of them wrote only in Sanskrit. All the great classics in the 4 schools of Buddhism were written in Sanskrit. So they used to study these books among traditional scholarly circles. So within 1 year, the fame of his great philosophical classics already spread all over India. They were discussing. At that time, he felt, well, his mother is about to die very soon. So many of you must have felt this in real life. If you ask a scientist, a psychologist, he may call you need to be certified. But in human life, you can find in the lives of many people. You find, suppose you love your mother or father, or maybe a deep spiritual intimacy. Whenever she actually expresses a strong desire to see you, it may happen to you, well, maybe your mother wants you, and you may write a letter, make a telephone call. This frequently happens. We don't know how this cannot be scientifically proved. Anyway, Shankaracharya felt that his mother's death was approaching, and he traveled from Benares to Kaladi, that is roughly around 2,000 miles, and reached there and consoled her and recited sacred mantras, Vedic mantras and Vedic prayers on her ears. This is the story of Shankaracharya. Swami Vivekananda refers to this interesting incident. Swamiji himself was a great example. He's a great philosopher, a great champion of Vedanta in modern times, but he always had in his heart a deep affection and love for his mother. Sri Ramakrishna, he was living in Vrindavan. So many of the devotees in Vrindavan wanted Sri Ramakrishna to continue living in Vrindavan, but he refused because he said his biological mother was in Dakshineshwar, and he saw no distinction between Kali, the spiritual divine mother of the universe, and his own biological mother. So you can find something very interesting. In Shankaracharya's life, he has written Madhur Panchakam, in which he says, you may pay back the debts to your brother, father, anyone, but you can never express your gratitude in words or actions, the gratitude that you feel for your mother. Now, the greatness of Shankaracharya was not just that he wrote all these great philosophical classics. He also wrote the most moving spiritual poetry, poetical works in Sanskrit. And not only that, even look at just example Bhagavad Gita, which is now considered to be the greatest and most important, the foundational work of Vedantic Hindu tradition. So from India, if some ambassadors, we go to Vatican, which is an independent state, they present the Pope is present and they give the Pope a copy of Bhagavad Gita. That is the most important philosophical, spiritual work of Hindu tradition. This book today we read because Shankaracharya wrote a commentary on Bhagavad Gita. Because this book was unknown before his time. It's only 700 verses. And it is just a small fragment of a much larger work, Mahabharata, which is a huge volume. 100,000 verses in its shorter version, more than 155 verses in its larger version. Bhagavad Gita is only a tiny fragment of this. What Shankaracharya did, he detached this Bhagavad Gita and wrote a commentary, and so we are reading the book. Bhagavad Gita was unknown because there are so many other works called the Gita. So, and again today we are talking about Vedanta. The Vedanta philosophy that we understand today was not known to anyone before Shankaracharya's advent. He wrote commentaries on certain important philosophical parts of Vedic literature from all the four Vedas. And he wrote these 10 commentaries plus Brahma Sutras and Bhagavad Gita, the 12 books that Sister Nivedita was referring to. And then, another very important thing, you cannot go to India anywhere and a villager in extreme east Tripura, somebody in extreme west Gujarat, the coastal state of Gujarat, extreme south, extreme north, Badrinath, 16,000 feet above the sea level. Even the average villager, the man who drives the taxi, the rickshaw, will tell you, oh, long back Shankaracharya came here. We don't know whether he came or not, but every villager, every rickshawala, every taxi driver has something to say to connect the place where he was born with Shankaracharya. This is the story of Shankaracharya. His statues and his images were excavated from places like Kandahar. It's called, now it's called Gandhara during Shankaracharya's time. Kandahar is in today's Afghanistan. So this is the work he did. Now what did he actually do? He wrote all these great works. He reformed Hinduism. Now, in his philosophy, it's called Advaita, which you may all know a lot about. He says, you don't have to go to temple and pray to a God to be spiritual. Because the God you are praying to is present in your own heart as the spiritual, as the divine spark. You realize this. Then you will start loving the entire humanity, entire creation. You feel a close spiritual affinity with the entire creation. This is a real spiritual goal of every human being. You can always pray, you can meditate, you can go to temples, churches, mosques, synagogues, Buddhist places. Okay, fine. Absolutely wonderful. But the ultimate goal should be to feel the presence of this divine within you and also within everything in this world. That means the philosophy of spiritual unity and oneness of existence. But the same Shankaracharya is the author of the most important, more than 100 devotional poetical works in Sanskrit, praying to different deities. So you can imagine, somebody who tells you, you don't have to go to a temple to be spiritual, also writes poetical classics praying to different deities. He also is the reformer of so many temples all over India. There are very few important temples in India. We don't claim some association with Shankaracharya. So I have to remember those, especially those who are living in Western world, may not be aware of this. So if you go to Google somewhere, you find Shankaracharya. Remember, Shankaracharya also is the name of an office, like a pope. So he established 4 monasteries in 4 different corners of India. Extreme north, in the Himalayas called Jyotirmad, extreme south, Sringeri, extreme east, Puri, and extreme west, Dwarka. 4 important monasteries. Now, the point is, each of these monasteries will have an abbot. And each of these abbots are called Shankaracharya. So, it is an office that claims to follow the lineage or heritage of the original Shankaracharya. So, we have to remember, somebody, Swami is talking about Shankaracharya, may learn more about it. And due to Google, you find one Shankaracharya today also. Another Shankaracharya is in different parts of India. You have to remember, this is like Pope. How do you relate Pope to St. Paul or St. Peter? Like that, you have to relate modern Shankaracharyas to original Shankaracharya who lived in the 8th century. This is a very important thing to remember. The difference or the affinity between modern Shankaracharyas and the real original Shankaracharya is the distinction or the similarity between modern popes and Jesus Christ or St. Paul, St. Peter, whatever it may be. This is an important thing to remember. Now, not only that, if you look at the Vedic literature, there are so many deities mentioned. Indra, Mitra, Varuna, Agni, Dua, Prithvi, Surya, and so on. It is a kind of polytheistic religion. Very similar to the ancient pre-Socrates, pre-Sophist Greek mystery religions. So many, if you read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, it's crowded with deities and gods and goddesses. So many you find. I'm trying to relate this philosophy to modern Western intellectuals because somehow to make them understand the similarity. There are so many deities in Vedic literature. Now, what Shankaracharya did, out of this, he evolved 5 concepts. And then he made a rule that every householder in his home should worship one of these deities. It's very interesting how the Hindu pantheon was formed by him. Let us say, Adityambigam Vishnum Gananatham Maheshwaram Panja Yajnaparo Nityam Grihastha Panja Puji. What it means is, I will explain this, it's a Sanskrit verse. Adityambigam Vishnum Gananatham Maheshwaram. 5 deities are mentioned here. The sun god, divine mother like Durga, Kali, also examples of the divine archetype. Vishnu, Vaishnavas, the ISKCON, Hare Krishna, all examples. Then there are those who worship Gananath, Ganapati, and then those who worship Shiva. In India you find many of these sects. So what he did, out of this huge Vedic pantheon of deities, he evolved 5 of them. And he said, till you attain the highest Advaitic experience, you can worship these deities. Remember, these are 5 dimensions of the same divine principle. People should not get away with the impression that Hindus have got 5 gods, 500 gods, 600. No. Every God idea in Hinduism is a symbolic representation of one dimension of divinity, of the one supreme reality. You can imagine the greatness of this concept. Suppose you imagine one big God, strong, muscular, sitting there with a big stick in his hand. Worship me, no one else. Or you will see the consequences. You can imagine. Contrast this with this idea. Suppose you have got in your community, in your family, people with different temperaments. You tell your son, your daughter, your brother, sister, well, what is your idea of the divine, the transcendental? You may like Buddha, okay, fine, a humanistic representation of the divine. You may like Christ, for example, the embodiment of, let's say, sacrifice, renunciation, mercy. Rama, the embodiment of dharma, justice, compassion for everyone. Like that. Or Sri Ramakrishna, for example, an embodiment of broad-mindedness, compassion, love, equality, oneness, etc. All these you can find in every higher religious tradition. There is one spiritual dimension which anyone can relate. So you follow that. How wonderful it is. That's why Swami Vivekananda says it is a very revolutionary statement. It needs some interpretation. Swamiji says, it's good if every human being in this world has his own God and Goddess. The world will be much better. But it doesn't mean that we need 8 billion gods and goddesses. No, that's not the implication. The implication is, actually, each of us have our own idea of the divine. And that idea is related to our own spiritual, cultural evolution. If you are very broad-minded, if you are very compassionate to your fellow human beings, you will think of a God who is compassionate. If you are very cruel to your servants or slaves, then you have to think of a God who is your master. Because sometimes this happens. People who can only accept a God who is a monstrous tyrant with an atomic bomb in his hands, threatening you to send you to hell or heaven, or promising heaven. Those people will treat others as slaves, because the slavish attitude with which they approach their God, they expect from all others. On the other hand, if you think of a God who is compassionate, who is present in all of everyone, who expresses in so many different ways, who manifests in so many different ways, according to our own spiritual evolution, such people will be compassionate, understanding, and will be tolerant. Vivekananda expresses this idea of Shankaracharya in his first Chicago address. Swamiji, you can imagine, it's a very great statement. It should be considered to be a new paradigm, the beginning of a new paradigm in religion and spirituality. The first Chicago address of Vivekananda. He talks about Hinduism as a mother of religion. Why do you call mother of religion? He says, Judaism came to India, and Hindu kings opened their doors, gave them villages, asked you settle here, and you build a synagogue, be happy. And they were honored for the last 2,000 years in India. Christians came, St. Thomas came in 52 AD. He was allowed to build a church, his own congregation. Later Syrians came, they also started their churches. Even Islam came to India almost between 50 or 60 years after the passing away of Prophet Muhammad. It didn't come through Afghan border. It came to the southwest of India. And the first Muslim mosque built in India, Chairman Masjid, you can find in the extreme southwest in Kerala. That is the second oldest Muslim mosque in the world after Mecca. And the second oldest Jewish synagogue is also about 20 miles away from there. So also you find Christian churches in India which were built long before Christianity became the national religion of Rome after Constantine's conversion, or long before the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. So all this happened because of this idea of oneness and unity of existence. And this idea was proclaimed by Shankaracharya, and he walked all over India. Actually, the place he was born is Kaladi. The literal meaning of the word in the vernacular where he was born, the vernacular language did not exist at that time. Sanskrit was the spoken language of his community. There was no vernacular at that time there. But there is a vernacular, and the real meaning of the place where he was born is the foot of the feet. And that was the instrument he used to travel all over India. He walked from east to west, north to south, 4 times. So, and not only that, he is also the founder of 6 schools of devotional philosophy. It's called Shanmata Sthavana. That is, Shaivam cha Vaishnavam Shaktam Sauram Vainayagam Tadha Skantam cha Bhakti Margasya Darsanani Shatevaki. All these are different sects and groups and cults. So he systematized this ancient society into 6 schools of religious traditions. But then he also taught all these are different names that we use to define or to call the same reality. So it is wrong to say that the Hinduism or Advaita that he founded was believed in polytheism. No. It was actually a monotheistic and monistic philosophy. Actually, it's monistic, going beyond the idea of one supreme person of God. It's okay. He accepted all traditions. Let us say, for example, what the ancient Native American religion, how it will appear in the light of Vedanta that he founded. That will make you get an idea of what it means. Suppose Shankaracharya had come here during his time. He would have found a different tradition, entirely different tradition. When we had to go to Africa. What he will say? Well, this also another approach towards the divine. But you should not stop here. So you can have your own interpretations. But remember, at the end of it, our goal is eventually to realize the truth that humanity is spiritually one family. Not only humanity, the entire creation is one spiritual family. If you hurt a plant, if you pollute the water or the air, then also you are actually violating the principle of unity and oneness of existence. This is the essence of his spiritual philosophy. And in the process, of course, you have to remember it's very difficult to give even a brief idea of what all he did. You can think of, Sister Nivedita had put it in such a forceful language. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi, K.M. Munshi, Swami Vivekananda, Dr. Radhakrishnan, so many other great thinkers, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, David Hume, Paul Deussen, Max Muller, Schopenhauer, all of them have given their own estimates of Shankaracharya's work. But the most powerful and the most comprehensive and the most forceful estimate comes from a most unlikely person, Sister Nivedita, a revolutionary thinker who was a great spiritual person, the greatest among the Western disciples of Swami Vivekananda. She says, this is a greatness we cannot understand, can only appreciate. The problem about talking about Shankaracharya is, if you talk about him, it's very difficult to not create the wrong impression that we are exaggerating. That's the problem. How can you just imagine her own words? The great musical geniuses of Catholic tradition, the great reformers of Catholic tradition, she includes Ignatius Loyola, Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther was a revolutionary in the beginning of the Protestant movement. He was the one who, of course, he did a great injustice by denying the concept of sainthood in Christianity and denied the possibility of mysticism. But still, Martin Luther was a great revolutionary reformer. And Sister Nivedita says, you can find in Shankaracharya a reformer like Martin Luther, a philosopher like St. Augustine, a theologian like St. Aquinas, musician, the greatest musicians, in Catholic tradition. The great musical tradition of Western world has a lot to do with the Catholic church, different monastic orders of Catholicism, because the clergy was responsible for the promotion of higher music in Western tradition. And Sister Nivedita says, all rolled into one. And this man lived only for 32 years. That's an interesting thing. After 16th year, he was mostly traveling all over India. And when he went to a temple, he stood there and he recited a prayer. And his disciples memorized. Remember, it is something very difficult for me to explain. Before modern education became well known, even in India, there were those who had memorized all the 4 Vedas. In today's world, you may think it's unbelievable or impossible. So Shankaracharya was not carrying a big library on his head. He was carrying a big library in his head. All the 4 Vedas, Mahabharata, he quotes from Mahabharata, 145,000 verses. 4 Vedas, so Samhita, Brahmana, Aranyaka, Upanishad. Actually, you know how he wrote the Gita Bhashya? He had kept in his head the entire Mahabharata. And then he wrote this in the manuscripts, palm leaves, he wrote. Shankaracharya says, and there, in the manuscripts, in his mind, he detached the 700 verses from Mahabharata. I wrote a commentary. Upanishads, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is from Yajurveda, Shukla Yajurveda, Chandogya from Samaveda, Taittiriya from Krishna Yajurveda, and then Kathopanishad also from Krishna Yajurveda, Aidreya from Rigveda. So he extracted in his mind, organized all the philosophical portions of the Vedic literature. You can find huge Vedic literature, and wrote a commentary on it. So today, if you buy Upanishads from our bookstore, you find Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It was not separate at that time. It was part of a huge forest. In his mind, he extracted all this and wrote a commentary. So you can find today Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Shankara Bhashya, Shankaracharya's commentary, translated in English, different languages. Paul Deussen did that for the first time in a very comprehensive manner. The most reliable interpretation in a non-Indian language is by Paul Deussen, who translated that into German. So Chandogya, Samaveda, in his head he put all this and wrote all this. And all that he did before he was 16 years. After there was no time, travel all over India. That's why I quoted Sister Nivedita, because I know if I am talking Western audience, talking about Shankaracharya, you may think this is absolutely exaggeration. How can a boy of 6 years carry in his head entire Mahabharata and 4 Vedas? All the books. Even I can tell you, they say Bhagavata, 18,000 verses, in 12 skandhas, the most important devotional philosophical work in Hindu tradition. Important for Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Vallabhacharya, Nimbarka, Madhva, Ramanuja, everyone. Bhagavata Purana. They say the modern Bhagavata Purana is a later work. In All India Oriental conferences, Sanskrit conferences, every year they have to put a new title for putting the presentation. Sometimes it goes to ridiculous lengths in search of novelty. But in most cases, one important thing, running theme is Bhagavata Purana is a later work. It belongs to a post-Shankara period. You know the reason? Because Shankaracharya doesn't quote from that. So it should not have become popular, well-known at that time. So practically there are very few books from which he doesn't quote. So, but I wanted to say something, then I shall conclude. I left it there half said. That is, people may imagine how a boy of that age could master everything. I don't say today you can find anybody who could do that. The point is, as modern technology becomes more and more advanced and more easily accessible for everyone, many of our native skills get atrophied due to lack of usage or maybe improper usage. Human beings are capable of doing much more than we all imagine through their mind. Human mind is has much more potential than we all imagine. So sometimes you find such people. It is different from extracting a new law from external nature, theory of relativity, or maybe gravitation. All these are new concepts. That's one way of taking something out of nature. But to create a system of philosophy, spiritual philosophy, new concept of life, new concept of living, and teaching humanity the idea of unity and oneness of existence, and teaching that to realize the unity and oneness of existence is the ultimate supreme goal of human life. This was his greatest work in my way. More than all the books he wrote. And remember, Shabdajalam Maharanyam Chitta Brahmanagaranam. He says in Muyachudamani, he says, these huge writing and reading huge books, it only leads to confusion. So, he says, Bhuktaye natu muktaye. It can only give you some intellectual enjoyment, but it cannot eventually lead you to spiritual enlightenment. The man who wrote all these books tells you books are nothing. That's the greatness. That's why he's really great. He wrote all these books. He says these books are nothing. But remember, when it comes from a man who wrote all these books, it will become more authentic. If an ignorant man tells, I don't believe in education, you won't believe it. But apparently, historically, the most learned human being in the history of humanity, and also the most hardworking person in the history of humanity, is Shankaracharya, according to Sister Nivedita, according to many. But you can find Swami Vivekananda used to educate his disciples in a very informal setting while traveling, especially during his Himalayan travels. It's magnificent. The two important sources of Vivekananda as a human being, to understand him as a human being. One, Swamiji's conversations with Sharachandra Chakravarti. Another source is the way he used to interact and inspire and teach and lead his Western disciples as he took them to different pilgrim centers, Mayavadi and other places. Swamiji goes to ecstasy talking about the ancient values, ancient teachings of the sages and sages. So when you read them, you understand a little bit of the greatness. But the Sister Nivedita, finally she says, this is a greatness we can only appreciate from a distance, but can never understand. So I have only made an attempt to just to give a bird view of the great work of Shankaracharya. And today is Mother's Day. Actually, in a way, it is very important. In spite of being such a great scholar, intellect, reformer, spiritual teacher, he also behaves like a humble child in front of his dying mother. So, this deep humanism, you can find Dr. Adhakshanan in his book Indian Philosophy, volume number 2, in which he deals with the Shankaracharya's philosophy. He says, in spite of all this, kind of deep humanism, he behaves himself like a little baby in the presence of his loving mother who was about to die soon. So, that's why, in spite of being such a great intellect, he was also a deep humanist. So, thank you, Namaskar. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
असंगोऽहं पुनः पुनः सच्चिदानन्द रूपोऽहम् अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः सच्चिदानन्द रूपोऽहम् अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः नित्यशुद्ध विमुक्तोऽहं निराकारोऽहम् अव्ययः भूमानन्द स्वरूपोऽहम् अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः शुद्ध चैतन्य रूपोऽहम् आत्मा रामोऽहमेव च अखण्डानन्द रूपोऽहम् अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः प्रत्यक्चैतन्य रूपोऽहम् शान्तोऽहं प्रकृतेः परः शाश्वतानन्द रूपोऽहम् अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः तत्त्वातीतः परात्मा मध्यातीतः परः शिवः मायातीतः परं ज्योतिः अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः नानारूप व्यतीतोऽहं चिदाकारोऽहमच्युतः सुखरूप स्वरूपोऽहम् अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः अन्तर्यामी स्वरूपोऽहम् कूटस्थः सर्वगोऽस्म्यहम् सर्वसाक्षि स्वरूपोऽहम् अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः निराधार स्वरूपोऽहम् सर्वाधारो हमेव च आप्तकाम स्वरूपोऽहम् अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः तापत्रय विनिर्मुक्तो देहत्रय विलक्षण अवस्थात्रय साक्ष्यस्मि अहमेवाहम् अव्ययः असंगोऽहम् 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 पुनः पुनः Satchidananda Rupoham Ahamevaham Avyayaha Ahamevaham Avyayaha Ahamevaham Avyayaha.
We have some very important announcements. So, we are going to celebrate this Memorial Day on Sunday, the 26th of May, and Monday is a Memorial Day, 27th of May. It will be held in our Ulima retreat, about 30 miles away from here. Most of you know about it. You can see our announcement in our website, savedanta.org. Or you can just Google Vedanta Society San Francisco. You can go to our website. And please do RSVP from our website. So, it's a very important announcement. This is perhaps one of the most important events in our Vedanta Society here, May 26th and 27th. The important event is on Memorial Day itself. That is Monday, May 27th. The program will begin morning at 10 o'clock. It will continue up to about 4:30 in the evening. And there will be lectures, presentations, Q&A, and lunch and snacks will be provided to devotees attending this event. Please RSVP from our website, savedanta.org, or you can just Google Vedanta Society San Francisco. The subject for the next Sunday is Why Advaita Matters. Childcare is provided during our Sunday lectures. On Sunday evenings, there is an online class at 6 p.m., the foundational text of Indian philosophy. It's sponsored by the Stanford University Hindu Students Association. The Zoom and YouTube links are available on our website homepage, as well as in the monthly email bulletin. On Wednesday evenings, we will have Vespers with meditation at 7:30 p.m. in this auditorium. On Friday evenings, there is a scripture class at the Old Temple at 7:30 p.m. Please use the auditorium entrance on Filbert Street. The current text for study is the Bhagavad Gita. The class also is streamed. So remember, Friday evening 7:30, we have Bhagavad Gita class in the Old Temple. You and your friends are cordially invited to attend all of our services. After the lecture, there will be a question and answer session in Vivekananda Hall. All are welcome. Please remember about this announcement, that is Memorial Day on 27th. Memorial Day 27th, Monday. This is an important function from morning at 10 o'clock. It will be over by 4:30, and there will be lunch will be provided to the attendees and snacks. Morning there will be lectures by different scholars, different delegates representing different religious traditions or philosophical traditions, and there will be interaction Q&A in the afternoon session. Thank you, Namaskar. It will be held in Ulima retreat. Thank you. Now we will have Q&A, question and answer session in Vivekananda Hall.